Yesterday, we had the CS for the National Treasury speaking about our debt situation and how we are able to, whether we are able to finance our operations or not, and what he needs to cut back on and why he needs to cut back on that. Because he basically says we have reached that point where borrowing is becoming a bad word in government. So we want to talk about debt sustainability and our debt issue and situation, whether the strategies being unveiled and being rolled out by the government are actually workable. Are those strategies workable? Our guest this morning, John Oduk, who is a policy research and advocacy officer at the Institute for Social Accountability, and David Owiro, research, public policy and advocacy expert. Good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning.
Welcome to Kenya's Biggest Conversation. It's good to have you here.
Karibuni
sana. John, there are other people who work at TISA. You know, we know Wanjiru Gekonyo of TISA. She has now left TISA, right? And there's a new executive director.
Yes.
Okay. We'll bring her here. Karibuni sana to the show.
Asante sana.
Right. When you say that someone is a policy research and advocacy expert, what exactly does that mean? I want to start with you, David. What do you do?
Thank you so much. Interesting question. Well, the kind of work that we do is basically generate or use policy evidence to craft alternative policy solutions, which we then present to decision makers and advocate with the decision makers so that we have better outcomes and impacts for the goals that we are looking to achieve.
So you're basically doing what Kipra does, but from the other side,
Yes.
from outside government.
Yes.
All right.
Yeah.
You conduct your own research, then you formulate policy proposals, then now you present that to government.
Yes.
And
both generating own research as well as utilizing other available
consuming
research.
other research
Yes.
as available.
Yeah.
All right. Now, we've been talking about the debt situation in the country for a while. And, we now have a new administration in his office. Ukuri Atani is no longer the CS. Well, the PSs are still the same until the new ones are vetted and then appointed. And we'll have new bosses at the National Treasury. But they're taking up a debt that's there. And the government has been talking about things that they want to do with debt. Just bringing us up to speed, what is it that Kenya Kwanza has said about our current debt situation and the situation going forward, David?
Right. Thank you so much. Well, the information that we can glean from their manifesto is that they have a very good understanding of where we are. They do acknowledge that we are in sort of like a strenuous debt situation. Some have termed it even a debt abyss, you can imagine. And that they acknowledge that this debt situation was mostly propagated by debt that was used to fund projects, and that these projects didn't have much meaningful impact. From an economic perspective, it didn't have a lot of multiplier effects to benefit people, particularly things that people care for. So they acknowledge that this debt needs to be reduced. The second thing that they say is that the debt composition needs to be changed. They do acknowledge that the biggest proportion of debt is actually domestic debt, stating that domestic debt actually comprises about 80% of the current debt outlay that we have. And they have gone further to state that actually, if you look at our debt repayments, basically what we pay every year, that number right now is just over 1 trillion. So that makes up a proportion of about 64% of what we raise in terms of revenues. And so that's quite a dire statistic. And so they acknowledge that this situation needs to change. And they use the words that we have to stop the digging. So that's all interesting to say. And it's all quite positive. It resonates with what Okwa Ochumi has been saying. Basically that our debt levels, if it continues to be so, will be unsustainable and will very quickly get into debt distress. What remains to be seen, of course, is the interventions that they want to put in place. They talk about reducing our expenditures, which is basically austerity. And they mention a number, 300 billion. We do not know where that number comes from. And we do not know the impact that number will have. What we are concerned about is what they deem as non-essential expenditures. What are these non-essential expenditures? Because if non-essential expenditures are things that Kenyans care for and things that have great impact for Kenyans, then we very quickly will have a problem.
According to you, John, what are these non-essentials? I mean, because if we're talking about strategies for the current government to be able to get Kenya out of, in my opinion, which already is teetering on debt distress, economic distress, what are some of these things then that must be clawed back on? We don't know where this 300 billion is going to come from. If you're looking at it from an economic point of view, where should it come from?
Okay, first of all, allow me to state that the current debt situation in Kenya, it's not a Kenya Kwanza problem. It's something that has been there from the previous regime, and it's something that now the current regime has inherited, and it's a situation that presently, as it is, they have to face it head on. In terms of maybe areas where, because the president talked about the cut on expenditure, that's by 300 billion. Yeah, there's still question about areas where that will come from. But then again, based on the current fiscal landscape, it's very tight, and one thing that we as a Okoa Uchumi campaign really champion for is amidst all this crisis that's currently happening, you're calling for the issue of priority spending. So in as much as they're focusing on the cuts, I think some of the key areas, or rather, yes, we've asked about the non-essentials, but let me speak to the essential areas that they shouldn't touch on. And this specifically speaks to social spending, things relating to education, health, water, sanitation, and social protection issues, because these are issues that really speak to the quality of life. They affect the quality of life of the population as a whole. So these are some of the areas that the cuts shouldn't touch on. But then again, if we talk about the non-essential areas that maybe these cuts could go into, maybe could maybe speak to areas around minimizing, maybe as alluded to from what we see, things like reducing maybe
Travel
allowances and everything. Yeah.
But even as they say this, that we need to cut back on some of these non-essential. We've heard it before. I mean, this is not the first time a government in the Republic of Kenya has talked about cutting back. We have heard it before. We are going to reduce the fleet of cars that we use so that people are going to be using carpooling. That was Uhuru Kenyatta, finance minister then. We are going to reduce the CCs for vehicles. So if you're ministers and senior government officers, you're going to have a maximum of 1,800 CCs. And if you have a vehicle that's a four-wheel drive that's more than 1,800 CCs, it's a pool vehicle. We've heard it before. Did it come to pass? We saw the Passats, but we still saw the fuel guzzlers. Hi. Just during this time of COVID, they talked about the same thing. We are going to cut back. What we need to do is now, of course, because COVID has shut down the world, there's no foreign travel, so our expenses on travel have reduced because there are no meetings as well. We're not doing in-person meetings, so our expenses on that have reduced. But did they really reduce? So even now, when you hear the government saying we're cutting back on non-essentials, do you have anything that you can actually go with and say, these guys are different from the previous guys? Is there anything?
I think on that, that's an interesting question, because if you look at the current regime, the head of the Kenya Kwanza administration was part of the previous regime where we saw ballooning of our fiscal position. And then on top of that, most of the individuals in this government, they're also part of the previous regime under different capacities. So it will be really interesting to see how they implement these proposals that they make. Because from my point of view, I really feel that there's a lot of sloganeering around these proposals with little content or depth on the interventions around their implementation. Yeah.
David, is there anything specific that you feel this ought to go from the current budget?
Interesting question. I think a number of things. First of all, we have to go back and answer this question. What does non-essential expenditures mean? For me, a budget at national level, everything should be priority. As in, you cannot spend on something that is not a non-essential. So even the usage of that word, for me, I'm triggered. Because it means that even government itself sees the games they're playing in our budget policy making. And, just to go back to the issues you've raised around some of the initiatives that they've taken to reduce budget expenditure, we've seen those initiatives actually turn around to be actually entrepreneurship opportunities, where, someone is looking to supply, say, whatever commodities, whatever vehicles, and we don't see actual impact on, a reduction in terms of budget as is intended. So we have to go back and see, okay, how do we, and it boils down, it distills to this conjoined problem that we have of corruption. Because really, if you look at the project spending, the mess we are in right now was basically to create corruption opportunities for people. And even the emergence of this term of budgeted corruption is really because people saw opportunities within our budget formulation process to also include their pet projects where they could make a buck or two. And so we have to come at it from all sides. We have to ensure that, whenever we are prioritizing our budget and selecting what is important, what is essential for Kenyans, that is actually national interest. And that has to be buttressed by an equal push for more transparency, more accountability, even within those projects that are funded by debt.
When you talk about debt and the stories about debt, the thing that seems to also take center stage in the discussion is how economists differ in thought as to what should be done. There are those who propose austerity measures and say these austerity measures are the way to go. And then another group comes up and debunks it completely and says, this one, either there was some data which was omitted or they simply presented what they considered was favorable. And yet, even as these discussions rage, whether it is in the form of a paper or an op-ed in a news outlet, it doesn't answer the real problems that countries have. Now, there are fundamentals, for instance. A country like Kenya, the one way that the previous government and this particular government seems to believe that they can help us get out of this so-called debt trap that we're in is by taxing us to death, okay? Now, there is no evidence to support that particular method of doing things, that raising taxations in a country helps grow the economy. There is nothing that you can point to and say, this is a country that grew and developed and became what it was because people were taxed to smithereens. There is no such thing. Yeah. And yet, it's a policy that they seem to continue following. You wake up and there's a new tax. You wake up and there's something else coming there. Now, how does one help a country and the thinkers in a country like ours understand the balance between this tax and also ensuring that there's sufficient circulation of money within the country so that this process of economic growth that we talk about can actually happen. How does one advise them? You are the experts in understanding financial matters.
Fantastic question. So it's interesting that you mentioned the fundamentals, the economic fundamentals. And really, when it comes to development, economic development and growth, the two main drivers are really that consumer demand, which is disposable income, the money circulating in people's hands, and government spending. What we seem to be going towards is we are raising both, we're trying to reduce government expenditure, so that you have a smaller budget, therefore a smaller budget deficit or even a zero budget deficit budget. Whilst at the same time also increasing taxes. And what does that do? It reduces that disposable income.
Yes, it does.
And therefore money circulating will be less and less. And that's a recipe for disaster, because we'll very quickly go into like a vicious cycle where you've got not only depressed demand coming from less expenses by government, but also just reduced consumer demand because taxes have reduced disposable incomes. And so what for us we are pushing for is, if we look at the debt problem, it's not a revenue issue. Therefore, we should not be trying to raise more revenue. Yes, you can seek to increase the tax base, basically bringing other previously untaxed people into the tax bracket. But if you are really expanding and targeting those indirect taxes, consumer taxes, what that ends up to do is you reduce disposable incomes.
What I find interesting, even when we discuss these matters, is how is it that it escapes the people who are charged with these functions that when you have increased economic activity, the base of taxable income increases, and yet they go about the business of reducing the very thing that would enhance these economic processes, which is the money, and yet expect to collect more money. Explain to me that logic. How does it make sense?
Well, it's really the institutional incentives that we've set up. So in our push to pursue efficiency, we've put in very ambitious targets. In this case, if you look at almost all revenue raising or revenue collecting, revenue administering institutions such as KRA or even your county revenue offices, there is really a push for more and more tax collection. And so, the targets are always going to be higher and higher the following year. And that sort of escapes, the initial issue, which is really, you can push a people, you can push a citizenry to the wall where really there's nothing much left that they can do. And your tax collection measures end up to be punitive. And we've seen that happening even at a micro level within our county governments, where the push for collecting fees, charges, cess and all that really just runs people out of business. So that's the balance that has to be done within our tax policy. And this has to come from a higher office. It has to be articulated at the national level by our planners that, hey, here is the taxation policy measures and our objectives that we're going for. And we've modeled it to the extent that it will not negatively impact our citizenry, both the private sector, the industry, as well as the people, so that there's a fine balance that we are able to walk.
Let's take a break, gentlemen. David Owiro is a research and public policy and advocacy expert. And John Oduk is also policy research and advocacy officer from the Institute for Social Accountability, both from Okoa Uchumi Coalition, Vugu Vugu la Okoa Uchumi. We're talking about debt crisis. Are Kenya Kwanza's debt strategies workable? That's the question we're asking ourselves.
This is the Situation Room, the only way to start your day.
We're talking about the debt situation in the country. The Kenya Kwanza strategies workable, achievable, realistic? Are they or are they not? John, are they not?
In terms of the proposals, maybe just looking at the whole borrowing scenario that we are in as a country, maybe I think one of the things that the government should really consider to maybe provide a remedy to the current debt situation in the country. I'd borrow from there is one of the premier civil society organizations in Africa that deals with the issues around public issues around debt and other finance-related areas. That's the Africa Forum and Network for Debt and Development, AFRODAD, and throughout its work for the past 25 years in this area, they came up with a debt management toolkit. It's called the African Borrowing Charter. So this charter, the aim is towards attaining sustainability in balancing public debt levels with the necessity for accelerating inclusive development, and also at the same time ensuring that service delivery is enhanced in Africa in general. So I think the toolkit speaks to some principles that would be essential for the government maybe to borrow from in terms of when they consider borrowing. And the toolkit has about the 9 principles, but maybe today I'd focus on around 4. Maybe the first one is urgency, and that principle, it speaks to, the government is an agent of the state. So as the government gets into these contractual agreements around debt, I think one of the things they need to consider is public interest. Because most of these people in government, they're elected to represent the public, so they're our agents. So our interest has to be considered in this. Then secondly, the issue of legal framework, where you find that issues relating to debt contraction and use should be anchored on constitutionalism. And in that, on our Kenyan context, I think it speaks to the principles underlined under the Public Finance Management Act. So a borrowing should consider that. And then the other thing is the issue of transparency and accountability. And this is one thing that TISA and the Okoa Uchumi Coalition is very it's something that the TISA and Okoa Uchumi champions, the issue of transparency and accountability. And now this touches on approval of this debt, procurement, and the oversight that comes with all kinds of borrowing and other forms of financing. And this particularly speaks to, when you talk about oversight, the role of critical oversight institutions come into play. And by institutions, I mean we have the Parliament, Office of Auditor General. We also have the Debt Management Committee. And when you just look at the issue of oversight, I think from where we are, I think maybe we could start looking towards maybe having an independent or rather a separate institution, separate from the ministry, the treasury, to just focus on the issue of debt, like we have KRA and taking care of revenue collection. So let's say if you have such an institution that their primary focus is on issue of debt, so that we can move from the current scenario where we see that mostly our debt is handled. It's more of just putting the statistics out there. But what goes beyond the statistics is very minimal. So I think if we have such, then it will take into account tackling the issue of debt just beyond posting these statistics. Then the other principle that is crucial is on disclosure and publication. And this particularly speaks to relevant terms and conditions of these agreements that the government gets into. With these agreements that we get into, debt agreements, mostly we've seen the debt situation, it skyrockets, especially when there is crisis. And when there is crisis, as a government, we are at a point of vulnerability. We are desperate to respond to the shocks that comes with, let's say, if you have a crisis. And if you look just at the structure of economies in Africa in general, the structure makes it hard to respond to shocks that come with this crisis. So this maybe now makes us inclined towards borrowing, and so this information needs to be disclosed. In as much as what we've seen is that there are lots of restriction to this, but then again, the toolkit speaks to the fact that these restrictions should be applied reasonably, because debt is something that the brunt of it affects the citizens the most. So the details that surround these agreements should be made public, so that this helps in scrutinizing the government in terms of how they're using this debt, and also just for the sake of transparency and accountability. Then maybe in interest of time, maybe I'll also just mention the other maybe crucial principles of this, maybe in terms of management of debt resources. It's crucial, and also the issue of avoiding overborrowing, which I think
I have to stop you and ask you, at what point do you overborrow? And at what point have you borrowed enough? And at what point have you not borrowed enough?
And if I could jump in and ask that question, because we're talking about, so in the event that Kenya could borrow, and I know you had a couple of points that maybe we can come back to in just a minute.
Yeah.
But we're looking at that situation that in the event that Kenya would borrow again, this and this and this is what ought to happen. And maybe you can also jump in here, David. But today, the today situation is that the CS Dungu has said there is no room to borrow. So as opposed to us being prescriptive for a futuristic situation when Kenya would borrow, what ought to happen today when Kenya cannot borrow? It's being prescribed by the Treasury that there is no room to borrow. Kenya is currently trying to mop up some shillings here to be able to apply to an already dire situation. We're going to go into the budgeting process already. It's in its throes right now, right? To then be announced, later on next year. But what ought to happen today with the situation whereby borrowing is not an option? The schedule for debt is, already in course, debt payments already on course. And the question is, the strategies that the government has in place today, is it essentially going to be, the messiah for the economic situation in which Kenya finds itself today? Will it work? We understand that it's not the Kenya Kwanza government who got Kenya in this mess that it's in. However, it's in a mess. Cannot borrow, has debt to pay, has to revive the economy and get it on its feet and secure livelihoods.
In the middle of a drought.
In the middle of a drought. In the middle of crises without number, coming off the back of COVID-19, How is it going to happen? Will these strategies work for all of these things that are happening simultaneously, back to back? And I think that's the question. Will the strategies work? Not in the future if Kenya will borrow. Today. When Kenya
can they
borrow.
work or can they not?
Yeah, I think in terms of what might be important or what needs to happen now, I think the issue of expenditure is the elephant in the room. How we utilize, how the government utilizes the resources that it has. Because currently the fiscal space is very tight. So I think one of the areas of consideration is maybe pushing for investments towards more productive sectors. Like, let's say, if the government invests or rather channels resources towards maybe growing of industries, manufacturing, because these are avenues for revenue mobilization. And if this is something that can be properly implemented, I think as an economy will be in a position to mobilize substantial revenue that could be used to sort of pay off some of the debts that we currently have, and also going forward reduce our over-reliance on debt.
On that debt.
Yes.
David, so you said that you people as researchers and policy advocates, you also come up with proposals. So first of all, answer that question. Are the current strategies realistic? Would they work? And what would your proposal be? If today David Owiro was the CS in the National Treasury, what would he do?
Right. So, of course, the simple answer is cut expenditure, because government expenditure is what has gotten us here. We have to cut our coat to our size. So that means we have to relook at our budget and identify what are the highest of highest priorities and focus on those. And a key guidance for me, a key principle would be much of the investment that has been done in the past has been around infrastructure development. Right now we have to focus on the productive economy. What is it that if we invest in would enhance our productive value? So that would be one guiding criteria. The other criteria would be, cut off the fluff, which, when we were starting, we identified it as being, these extravagant things that we do as a government,
That's
which
called
are not
non-essential.
the so-called non-essentials, so that we find better innovative ways of working. And really, you can see what drives those non-essentials, what drives the per diems and the allowances, really is a wage problem, because people are not earning enough, so the bureaucracy is incentivized to go for
look for other ways
of putting something in their pockets. So that would be the start. The other point that has to be done alongside it is we have to talk to our lenders. We honestly have to talk to our lenders. We have to come to the table for them to articulate the issue the current situation we are in, so that we get moratoriums. Because honestly, if 64% of our revenues
is
are
going
towards
debt.
Yes, I mean, where would we have the breathing room to even grow, to even invest in the things that matter for Kenyans? So
Our biggest lender is China. So have a conversation with
it's not unprecedented.
Rwanda. Just got something the other day.
Yeah, it's not unprecedented, because even in some African nations have been able to say, hey, this one we think we will not pay, to be honest. Yes, we see the investment, but this one we will not pay.
But David, is are China really the people we borrow the most from? I thought you mentioned that most of the money we borrow is domestic.
Yeah, so if you look at it from external borrowing,
Oh, from the external borrowing.
they're the biggest. Yeah.
Well, let me ask this question, because again, you know, what you've just said, that idea was put forth by two individuals, and that idea has caused problems. A gentleman by the name of Reinhardt, and another guy called Rogoff. They proposed this, and many countries took it up. A gentleman by the name of George Osborne, who later became Chancellor of the Exchequer, you know where, cited this person regularly. Unfortunately, their thinking about borrowing, cutting down, and the thinking around it have continuously and continually been debunked. That's the unfortunate thing. Yet, I look at a country like Japan. You say we borrow domestically 70%, or thereabouts?
Yeah, 80%.
So 80%?
Yep.
It's more than Japan. Japan, the equivalent of their central bank, takes 70% of their bonds. The rest, Japanese banks, trust funds, and all this. Now, you are the people who understand finance, and you know the benefit of this. These vagaries of the global market, they're shielded from because it's domestic borrowing. These fluctuations that have to do with all sorts of things, they're borrowed in yen. If the bulk of our borrowing is local, how is it that then this 20% that we borrow externally, how does it affect us so much? What is it about it that makes it affect us so much?
Right, so two things that happen.
Yes.
The first is our external funding is mostly in foreign currency, right? So we are faced with that volatility. As you know, our shilling is not free floating as much as we like it to be.
What is it, free flying?
It is managed. it's a managed, so-called managed float.
Yes.
So that has its impacts in our economy. The second thing that we have to acknowledge is we are an importing country, largely importing
We are
country.
net importers.
Yeah. So that means that we utilize forex exchange. We need forex, right? So external financing therefore affects us so much because not only are we borrowing in a foreign currency, but our chances of earning it, the opportunities of earning that foreign currency is also quite limited. Unlike the situation we've explained with Japan. Now, Japan, you can imagine, it's a big economy, and the domestic economy itself is a thriving one. They are, I would say, even net exporters.
You've gotten to the heart of the matter. How did they get there?
That's the
Our
question.
president usually went to Korea, very compared with us in the 60s.
Yeah.
They are there. How did they get there? Because we are following policies now, talking about getting to the situation where the Asian tigers are. But are these policies that we have now the sort of policies that will take us there, really?
Good question. and that's really what is up for debate. For me, in my perspective, from my reading of economics, where we are today, we have to reset. And that's really the biggest task that this current administration has. We have to look at it as a transition moment where we reset and get our fundamentals right. And getting our fundamentals right means that even from a productive economy perspective, we have to invest in those things that generate value for us. We cannot continue to be a continuously consuming economy because that's what we've evolved to. And we've left the traditionally productive sectors of the economy to falter behind. And we have a big opportunity because Kenya geographically is well situated, particularly with the service sector within the region. And so we have a starting point. I would say a lot of things are going well for us. So the task today for economists today is really to think about, how do we get the fundamentals right? And one of the things has to be that we have to, rejig our borrowing framework so that we borrow for things that matter to us and the things that are impactful for the opportunities we are looking for. We have to invest in the productive economy so that we put money in people's pockets, create employment.
Yes. I'm in full agreement. How do you get money into people's pockets? There are tools the government can use. The tools the government has at its disposal through the central bank. Interest rates. Because if you reduce interest rates, very many things happen automatically. Things become affordable. Yes, go ahead.
Good question, and you have your finger on it. The issue with interest rates is that because the government is so much in the domestic market, we can't have favorable interest rate that encourage that borrowing. We can't have it. So rather than going via the central bank or monetary policy, the solution is really to stop borrowing. That's the solution, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing, and you know, you alluded to this, you know, with the special fund, the Hustlers Fund that is being launched today. If you look at these special funds, the primary motive is really so that you can provide a solution for those marginalized, right? Mm-hmm. So you're looking for these special groups whom in ordinary circumstances are unable to access finance, right? However, all of us can't access finance. So even if you
we all marginalized.
Yes. So if you cater to that marginal constituency, really it won't solve the issue because all of us can't access it. And the reason we can't access it, all of us, is because the government is borrowing too much in the domestic market. So to your question, the answer really is in government to stop borrowing from the domestic market or to scale it back.
A lot of these things we talk about is that government should do. And these government that we speak of is made up of individuals who can think about these processes in the same manner in which we think and speak of them today. It's like going to a doctor and you're sick and the doctor prescribes medication. The truth of the matter is that if you do not take that medication, you will get sicker and at some point you may die. The question is, if these things that we are talking about that ought to happen, stop the borrowing in the domestic market, reduce interest rates, put money in the hands of the drivers of the economy, essentially, which is maybe what the answer of this fund, by this fund, is supposed to be. If those things are not done, the situation will exacerbate. Kenya will fizzle into a state that will be then very difficult to get out of. That is what is going to happen if these things are not done. Now the question is, ought this not to happen in order for folks to sit up and take notice? Because we can talk about this until the cows come home, but until anything is done about it, the situation gets worse.
Yeah, maybe allow me to come in on that. I think...
in about 30 seconds, because our hour is up.
Okay. Yeah, so I think in regards to that, I think the issue of political goodwill and governance comes to play. Because I believe we have excellent policies that govern, or even just if you look at the Public Finance Management Act, it outlines principles that
all the laws and policies are in place.
Yes,
it's just the people to come and do it. Yes or no? Do you feel this Kenya Kwanza has the intention to get it done? Yes or no?
I'd say the...
Yes or no?
He'd say yes or no.
or perhaps, or maybe. Okay, we'll continue this conversation next time. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us. John Oduk and David Owiro are both research public policy advocates working with the Institute for Social Accountability. Keep it here for more conversations.